I paid for his entire life. I worked 3 exhausting jobs so he would never go to bed hungry. Today I walked into his $1 million wedding at the Waldorf Astoria, wearing the simple dress he begged me to wear, so I would not draw attention. I truly thought I was there to celebrate his new life with an affluent family. But when I looked at my seat card, the bride and her wealthy friends burst into laughter. It did not say, "Sister of the groom." The card had 3 words that proved the boy I raised was gone. Before tonight ended, the most powerful man in the room would drop to his knees in front of me, and my brother's new family would lose absolutely everything. My name is Nora, and I am 34 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever sacrificed everything for a family member, only to have them betray you for a taste of wealth. The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria in New York City was a sea of crystal chandeliers, imported white roses, and guests dripping in designer diamonds. I stood at the entrance holding my modest clutch, wearing the understated navy dress Leo specifically requested I buy. He told me his new in-laws, the Caldwells, were very traditional. I smoothed down the fabric, feeling a mix of deep pride and bone-deep exhaustion. 16 years of working graveyard shifts, paying for his braces and his college tuition, had finally led to this spectacular moment. My brother was marrying into a prominent family, stepping into a life of comfort I could only dream of giving him. I walked confidently toward the front of the room, scanning the intricately decorated tables. Table 1 and Table 2 sat right next to the stage reserved for the immediate families. I smiled at a few guests, looking for my name among the silver-plated cards. Richard Caldwell, Brenda Caldwell, Simone Caldwell. I checked the next table. Groomsmen, bridesmaids, extended family of the bride. Nothing. I walked around the massive floral centerpiece, my brow furrowing in confusion. There was no card for me at the family tables. "Excuse me, miss." A sharp voice cut through the soft string quartet music. I turned to see a tall woman with a headset and a tight bun holding an elegant tablet. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my plain dress and unbranded shoes. Her expression shifted from professional to overtly condescending. "Are you lost? The staff entrance is down the hall to the left." I felt a flush of heat rise in my cheeks, but I kept my voice perfectly level. "I am not staff. I am the sister of the groom, Nora. I am looking for my seat." The wedding planner raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. She tapped her screen a few times, letting out a heavy sigh as if I were a tremendous inconvenience. "Sister of the groom, let me see. Ah, yes, Nora. Follow me, please. Follow me." She did not lead me toward the front. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched toward the absolute back of the sprawling ballroom. I followed her, my heart beating a little faster with every step. We walked past Table 10, then Table 20, then Table 30. The floral centerpieces grew noticeably smaller the further back we went. The lighting grew dimmer, casting long shadows across the heavy carpet. Finally, we stopped in the darkest, most isolated corner of the entire room. Table 40 was pushed aggressively close to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The sharp smell of industrial dish soap and roasted meat hung heavy in the air. To my right, a large illuminated sign pointed toward the public restrooms. The table itself was small, wobbly, and practically touching a massive stack of extra serving trays. "Here you are," the planner said, her tone dripping with false politeness. "Please take your seat quickly before the grand entrance begins." I stood completely frozen, staring at the tiny table. It was entirely empty except for one single chair and one solitary place card resting on the stark white cloth. There were no other guests assigned to sit here, just me, separated from the entire wedding party, hidden away like a dirty secret. My hands trembled slightly as I reached out to touch the beautifully embossed card. I thought there had to be a mistake. But as my fingers brushed the heavy cardstock, I flipped it over to read the intricate calligraphy. It did not say "Sister of the Groom." The elegant, swirling gold letters spelled out my ultimate humiliation in clear ink. Nora, the housemaid. I stared down at the card, tracing the heavy gold ink with my eyes to make sure I was not hallucinating. It was not a typo. It was a deliberate, calculated statement. The wedding planner had already vanished, leaving me entirely alone in the dim light of the back corridor. The constant clattering of porcelain plates and the shouting of chefs behind the swinging kitchen doors felt like a mocking soundtrack to my humiliation. I did not cry. Years of navigating cutthroat corporate boardrooms had trained me to recognize a targeted power play when I saw one. I took a slow breath, absorbing the sheer disrespect. Before I could even turn the insulting place card face down, a chorus of high-pitched laughter echoed over the smooth jazz playing in the background. I looked up to see Simone Caldwell making her grand approach. She was undeniably breathtaking. At 25 years old, she possessed the kind of flawless, aggressive elegance that old money practically guaranteed. Her custom silk gown cascaded across the carpet, and her diamond necklace caught the dim lighting of my secluded corner. Flanking her were 4 bridesmaids, all dressed in matching champagne satin, looking at me like I was a stain on the marble floor. Simone stopped a few feet from my wobbly table. She did not look apologetic in the slightest. Instead, a slow, deeply patronizing smile spread across her perfectly glossed lips. She tilted her head, her dark eyes sweeping over my simple navy dress, pausing on my unbranded shoes, before finally resting on the gold-lettered place card. "Oh, I am so terribly sorry," Nora Simone said, though her voice carried a melodic lilt of absolute amusement. The wedding planner must have gotten confused with the seating chart. She took a step closer, the heavy scent of her exclusive designer perfume momentarily masking the smell of kitchen grease. "You see, Leo was telling us all about his childhood the other night at the rehearsal dinner. He mentioned how you used to scrub toilets at that filthy roadside diner just to keep the lights on for him. He talked about how your hands were always cracked from the cheap bleach. I suppose when the catering staff saw your name on the VIP list, they just assumed you were an old maid he took pity on. It is an easy mistake to make, really, considering how you presented yourself tonight." One of the bridesmaids let out a sharp snort, quickly covering her mouth with a manicured hand to hide her grin. Simone did not reprimand her friend. She simply kept her calculating gaze locked on mine, waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to act like the desperate, uneducated trash they all assumed I was. She wanted a scene. She wanted to prove to her wealthy friends that Leo's sister belonged in the gutter. "But look at the bright side," Simone continued, gesturing grandly toward the swinging doors. "At least you are right next to the kitchen staff. If you get bored during the father of the bride speeches, you can always pop back there and ask the chef if they need someone to pick up a quick dishwashing shift. I am sure they pay minimum wage, which must be incredibly nostalgic for you. Plus, that plain dress you are wearing looks like it could easily double as a uniform anyway." The sheer audacity of her words hung heavily in the air. This was the woman my brother had chosen to marry. This was the family he was so desperate to impress. They viewed my immense sacrifice, the blood and sweat I poured into keeping my brother fed and clothed, as a hilarious punchline. I had given up my college dreams. I had given up my entire youth. I had worn second-hand coats for winters so he could wear brand new sneakers to high school. And this was my reward. What Simone did not know, what absolutely no one in that ballroom knew, was that the dirty roadside diner she was laughing about was the first piece of commercial real estate I ever purchased. And the venture capital firm I built from the ground up now controlled the very financial oxygen her father's failing tech empire needed to survive. I had the power to freeze their assets and bankrupt their family with a single phone call. I felt a cold, sharp smile threaten to break across my face. I opened my mouth, preparing to deliver a retort that would shatter her arrogant glass house into a million pieces. But before I could speak a single syllable, I saw a familiar figure rushing toward us through the crowd. It was Leo, my little brother, the boy I had protected from the harsh world. He looked spectacular in his tailored tuxedo, his hair perfectly styled, his posture rigid with the confidence of a newly minted executive. He pushed past the giggling bridesmaids and stepped directly between Simone and me. I let out a slow, quiet breath, the tension leaving my tight shoulders. He had seen the insulting card. He had heard his bride laughing at my expense. Finally, I thought to myself, finally, the boy I raised was going to be a man. I waited for him to look at his new wife, demand a sincere apology, and firmly defend the sister who gave him absolutely everything. He did not look at his wife. He did not ask for an apology. Instead, Leo marched right past Simone, grabbed my upper arm with a painful vice-like grip, and yanked me forward. The sudden movement caught me off guard, and I stumbled slightly in my heels. Before I could process what was happening, he was dragging me away from table 40, pushing me through a set of heavy velvet curtains and into a secluded, dimly lit service hallway. The sounds of the jazz band and clinking champagne glasses faded into a muffled hum. I pulled my arm out of his grasp, rubbing the spot where his fingers had dug into my skin. "Leo, what on earth are you doing?" I asked, my voice tight with confusion. "Your wife just insulted me in front of her friends. She called me a maid." Leo ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his face flushed with anger. His eyes, the same brown eyes I used to read bedtime stories to, glared at me with pure venom. "Could you not make a scene for one single night?" he hissed, taking a step toward me. "I asked you to come here, keep your head down, and just blend in. But you are standing out there looking like you are ready to start a brawl." I stared at him, genuinely stunned. Start a brawl? I was looking for my seat. You sat me next to the kitchen doors with a card that called me a housemaid. "Keep your voice down," Leo snapped, glancing nervously back at the velvet curtains. "Simone was just making a joke. And honestly, Nora, what did you expect me to tell them? The Caldwells are old money. They belong to exclusive country clubs. They spend their summers vacationing in Europe. Do you seriously think I could walk up to Richard Caldwell and tell him my sister is a college dropout who raised me in a rusted-out trailer park?" The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. A college dropout. He said it with such casual disdain, completely erasing the reason why I dropped out in the first place. I left university my freshman year because our mother walked out on us, leaving a 15-year-old boy with no food, no electricity, and an eviction notice on our front door. "I dropped out to take care of you," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I worked the morning shift at the diner, the afternoon shift at the grocery store, and cleaned office buildings at night so you could stay in school. I bought you those expensive lacrosse sticks so you could fit in with the rich kids. I paid for your college tuition in full so you would not graduate with a single dime of debt." Leo rolled his eyes, a gesture so dismissive it made my blood run cold. "Oh, here we go again. The great martyr speech. You always do this, Nora. You always hold the past over my head. Listen to me very carefully. You chose to work those 3 jobs. That was your choice. I never asked you to play the tragic hero. I was just a kid. It was not my burden to carry, and I am not going to let your miserable past ruin my future." I stood frozen in the narrow hallway. The sheer rewrite of our history was breathtaking. He was actively gaslighting me, twisting my years of exhaustion and starvation into a selfish vanity project. He was acting as if I had ruined my own youth, just for the fun of it, completely ignoring the fact that without me, he would have ended up in the foster care system. I looked at the man standing in front of me, the expensive tuxedo, the gold watch gleaming on his wrist, the arrogant tilt of his chin. The little brother who used to cry in my arms when the electricity got shut off was completely dead and gone. In his place stood a greedy, pathetic stranger who was willing to sell his own blood for a seat at a wealthy table. "You told them I was a maid," I stated flatly, not as a question, but as a final confirmation of his betrayal. "I told them you were a former caretaker who fell on hard times," Leo corrected defensively. "It makes me look generous for inviting you." Simone's family respects people who pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but they do not associate with the lower class. I finally have a chance to be somebody, Nora. Richard got me a senior executive position at Apex Capital. I am going to be making more money in a month than you have seen in your entire life. Do not ruin this for me. Just go sit down, eat your free meal, and slip out the back door before the family portraits start. He adjusted his bow tie, gave me one last warning glare, and pushed his way back through the velvet curtains. He adjusted his bow tie, gave me one last warning glare, and turned to push his way back through the velvet curtains. But before his hand could even touch the heavy red fabric, another figure stepped into the dim light of the narrow service corridor. The air instantly grew colder, heavy with the scent of an overpowering floral perfume. It was Brenda Caldwell, the mother of the bride. She stood blocking the exit, wrapped in an impeccably tailored emerald silk gown that probably cost more than the diner I used to work at earned in a month. A thick diamond tennis bracelet sparkled on her wrist, catching the faint flickering light of the hallway bulb. At 55 years old, Brenda carried herself with the terrifying, unbothered authority of a woman who was entirely used to getting exactly what she wanted. She did not step aside. Instead, she let her sharp, calculating gaze sweep slowly over my entire body. She looked at my simple navy dress, my sensible heels, and my unstyled hair, her upper lip curling into a faint but unmistakable sneer of utter disdain. Leo froze instantly. His aggressive posture melted away, replaced by the eager, submissive slouch of a man desperate for approval. "Brenda," he stammered, his voice dropping an octave. "I was just making sure my sister knew where her table was. I am heading right back to Simone right now." Brenda did not even look at him. "Go back to your bride, Leo," she commanded softly, her eyes still locked on mine. "I will have a brief word with your guest." Leo did not hesitate. He did not look back at me. He practically scurried past his mother-in-law and vanished through the curtains, leaving me entirely alone with the matriarch of the Caldwell family. The muffled sounds of the jazz band seemed to fade even further away, leaving only the sharp hum of the kitchen refrigerators echoing through the corridor. Brenda took a slow, deliberate step toward me. "I want to be perfectly clear with you, Nora." She began, her voice smooth and coated in a thick layer of passive-aggressive poison. "I am not an ungrateful woman. I know the bare minimum facts of your family history. I know that your mother abandoned you both, and I know that you stepped up. You provided shelter. You provided food. You kept my son-in-law alive when he had nothing. For that basic level of survival, you have my polite thanks." She paused, tilting her head as if examining a particularly unappealing insect. "But keeping someone alive is vastly different from giving them a life. Leo is a Caldwell now. He belongs to our world. We are his real family moving forward. We can provide him with the social standing, the elite network, and the financial pedigree that you could never even begin to comprehend. You did your job as a temporary caretaker, but your shift is officially over." I stood my ground, my face a carefully constructed mask of absolute calm. I did not interrupt her. I wanted to hear every single arrogant word she had to say. "You see," Brenda continued, a triumphant gleam flashing in her dark eyes, "my husband Richard is a highly influential man. He has connections that move markets. Just yesterday, he pulled a few massive strings and secured Leo a senior vice president position at Apex Capital. I am sure someone in your tax bracket has no idea what that firm is, but let me assure you, it is the pinnacle of Wall Street power. Richard got him that job to finally wash the trailer park dirt off his hands. We are elevating him. We are scrubbing away the poverty you represent, so you need to understand your place tonight." She took one final step closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, icy whisper. "You are going to go back to your little table by the kitchen. You are going to eat your dinner quietly. And before the photographer begins organizing the official family portraits, I expect you to slip out the back doors and call yourself a cab. You do not belong in our family pictures. You do not belong in our lives. Enjoy the prime rib, Nora. It is the best meal you will ever eat." With a final dismissive wave of her manicured hand, Brenda turned around and swept back through the velvet curtains, leaving me standing alone in the shadows of the service hallway. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of absolute clarity. The Caldwell family believed they were untouchable gods. They believed Richard's failing tech company gave them the right to step on the people they deemed beneath them. They had no idea that the very firm they were bragging about, Apex Capital, belonged entirely to me. They had no idea that Richard had been begging my executives for a bailout loan for 6 months just to avoid federal bankruptcy. A genuine, radiant smile broke across my face. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dark hallway. I opened my messages, selected the contact for David Mitchell, my lead executive at Apex Capital, and typed out a single definitive sentence. Initiate the hostile takeover. I hit send, slipped the phone back into my bag, and walked calmly back into the ballroom. The game was over. It was time for the execution. I hit send, slipped the phone back into my bag, and walked calmly back into the ballroom. The game was over. It was time for the execution. The transition from the quiet hallway back into the massive ballroom was jarring. The string quartet had finished playing, replaced by the clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of 500 wealthy guests finishing their appetizers. I navigated my way past the sprawling centerpieces and designer gowns, returning to my wobbly seat at table 40. The kitchen doors swung open behind me, hitting my chair slightly, but I barely registered the impact. I smoothed my dress and sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the front. The lights in the grand hall dimmed, leaving only the main stage bathed in a bright spotlight. A hush fell over the crowd as Richard Caldwell stepped up to the microphone. At 58 years old, Richard possessed the imposing physical presence of a man who spent his entire life demanding attention. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist as he adjusted the stand. He looked every bit the successful CEO of Caldwell Tech, radiating an aura of generational wealth and corporate dominance. I watched him smile warmly at the audience, projecting the perfect image of a proud patriarch. It was a brilliant performance for a man drowning in $40 million of hidden corporate debt. Thank you all for being here tonight, Richard began, his deep voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Tonight we celebrate not just a union of two young people, but the continued expansion of the Caldwell legacy. When my grandfather started our family business, he built it on the pillars of excellence and unwavering success. Today, Caldwell Tech stands as a titan in the industry, a testament to what happens when brilliant minds operate with unlimited resources. We do not just participate in the market, we dictate it. And that is the exact same standard of excellence I demand in every aspect of my life, especially when it comes to the man who marries my only daughter. He paused, allowing the polite applause to wash over the room. He raised his champagne flute toward the head table where Simone and Leo sat beneath a massive arch of imported white orchids. Richard's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold and calculating as they locked onto my brother. When Simone first brought Leo home, I will admit I was skeptical. We all know the Caldwells come from a very specific pedigree. We are accustomed to a certain standard of living, a certain caliber of associates. And Leo, well, let us just be honest among friends. Leo came to us with absolutely nothing. A few soft chuckles rippled through the VIP tables near the front. Leo shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushing a deep crimson, but he kept his forced smile plastered on his face. Richard continued, his tone dripping with a suffocating, patronizing warmth. He came from a very difficult background. A broken home, a severe lack of proper guidance, and a complete absence of financial stability. He had no real family legacy to speak of. He was a young man surviving on scraps, struggling to find his footing in a world that had not been kind to him. But the Caldwell family has always believed in charity. We believe in lifting up those less fortunate. Richard walked to the edge of the stage, gesturing grandly toward Leo, like a prize he had won at a silent auction. When I looked at this boy, I did not see his poverty. I saw a lump of clay that the Caldwell family could mold into something respectable. I saw a charity case that with enough of our money and our influence could be polished into a man worthy of standing next to my daughter. We gave him a real home. We gave him access to our exclusive circles. Just yesterday, I used my personal connections to secure him a senior executive position at Apex Capital. We gave him a future because his own blood could provide him with nothing but minimum wage labor. The guests erupted into applause, charmed by Richard's narrative. They looked at Leo with pity, treating him like a stray dog. Leo nodded, raising his glass to Richard in a pathetic display of gratitude, validating every insulting word. I sat in the shadows, my face devoid of emotion. Richard thought he was delivering a triumphant monologue showcasing absolute power. He had no idea he was reading his own financial obituary. The room clapped louder. Richard raised a hand to quiet them down, smiling coldly as his gaze scanned the back of the room to finally find me. Richard locked eyes with me, his smile widening into something predatory and cruel. He lifted his hand, pointing his crystal champagne flute directly at table 40. The heavy silence in the room shifted into palpable curiosity as 500 wealthy guests turned their heads to follow his gaze. I sat perfectly still, the swinging kitchen doors just inches behind me, feeling the sudden crushing weight of 1,000 eyes landing on my simple navy dress. "I am told we have a very special guest with us tonight," Richard announced, his voice booming through the speakers and dripping with theatrical sympathy. Sitting way in the back, right where she feels most comfortable, is Leo's former caretaker. Nora is it. Let us all give a polite round of applause for Nora. A smattering of weak, confused clapping echoed through the ballroom. People whispered to each other, peering through the dim light to get a look at the woman the great Richard Caldwell had just singled out. I did not wave. I did not. I did not look away. I kept my gaze fixed dead ahead, meeting his arrogant stare with absolute freezing calm. Now, Nora Richard continued, taking a slow step toward the edge of the stage, leaning into the microphone, so his voice dropped into a low, patronizing purr. "My wife Brenda informed me about your situation. She told me how hard you struggled in the past. We know you did the best you could with your extremely limited resources and your lack of formal education. It must be incredibly intimidating for you to be sitting in a room like this, surrounded by success and actual enterprise." He paused, letting his insult marinate in the quiet ballroom. Simone leaned her head against Leo's shoulder, a broad, mocking smile plastered across her face. Leo refused to look up. He stared intently at his empty plate, his hands gripped tightly in his lap, proving in real time that his spine was made of absolute jelly. But as I said earlier, Richard boomed, his voice rising to a triumphant crescendo. "At Caldwell Tech, we believe in charity. We believe in taking care of those who cannot take care of themselves. We already saved your brother from a life of poverty, and because I am a generous man, I am willing to extend that same grace to you." The room was dead silent. Even the kitchen staff behind the swinging doors had stopped moving, sensing the incredible tension radiating across the venue. Nora Richard said, his tone turning crisp and authoritative. "I want you to report to my corporate office on Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. Tell the front desk that Richard Caldwell sent you. We just fired our overnight cleaning crew and I have an opening for a janitor. It pays minimum wage, but considering your resume, I think it is a step up. Consider it my wedding gift to you, so you never have to be a financial burden to my daughter and my son-in-law again." For a split second, the ballroom was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. And then the room completely erupted. It started at the head table with Simone, who let out a sharp theatrical laugh that echoed through the microphone on the table. That sound acted as a permission slip for the rest of the room. Soon the bridesmaids were giggling behind their hands. The groomsmen were chuckling. The wealthy executives and socialites at the front tables broke into raucous laughter, raising their glasses to Richard as if he had just delivered the greatest comedic punchline of the decade. They were laughing at the poor, uneducated maid who dared to show her face at a high society gathering. The older relatives of the bride pointed fingers in my direction, shaking their heads in mock pity. I watched Brenda Caldwell sip her champagne, nodding approvingly at her husband's ruthless display of dominance. But the worst part was not the strangers laughing at me. The worst part was watching my own brother, the boy I had starved for, sit there and let it happen. Leo did not defend me. He did not storm out. He simply let the Caldwell family use my dignity as a floor mat to wipe their expensive shoes on. I sat alone at table 40, surrounded by the deafening sound of 500 people mocking my entire existence. I felt the heat of humiliation try to creep up my neck, but I ruthlessly forced it down. This was their moment. This was the peak of their arrogant delusion. I looked at Richard Caldwell, watching him bask in the applause of his peers, completely unaware of the reality of his situation. Here was a man standing on a stage paid for by embezzled employee pension funds. A man whose company bank accounts were currently frozen by my legal team. A man who was exactly 48 hours away from being investigated by federal authorities for corporate fraud. And he was standing in front of 1,000 people, offering the owner of the venture capital firm that held his entire debt portfolio a job cleaning his toilets. The irony was so utterly delicious, I could taste it. I did not cry. I did not storm out. I simply reached for my water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and waited for the laughter to die down. They had played their final card. The stage was officially set for my response. The laughter in the room began to settle into a low, buzzing murmur, but the humiliation was far from over. Before Richard Caldwell even stepped down from the stage to return to his seat, a tall, visibly intoxicated man stumbled away from the groomsmen table. He was one of Simone's cousins, a guy I recognized briefly from the rehearsal dinner but had never actually spoken to. He held a crumpled white linen napkin in one hand and a heavy gold-plated fountain pen in the other. He swayed slightly as he made his way across the ballroom, a wicked, lopsided grin stretching across his face. The guests sitting near the back tables realized exactly what he was doing and quickly shifted their chairs to watch the spectacle. He reached table 40 and slammed his hands down on the wobbly surface, making my water glass rattle violently. The heavy, suffocating stench of expensive bourbon and strong cologne wafted over me. "Here you go, sweetheart." He slurred his voice intentionally, loud enough to draw the attention of everyone within a 50-foot radius. "Uncle Richard is a very busy man, so I am handling the human resources paperwork for him tonight. This is your official Caldwell Tech janitorial employment contract. Sign on the dotted line, and we will even throw in a free uniform so you do not have to keep wearing that cheap dress." The group of guests who had gathered around my table burst into fresh, vicious laughter. A few women in shimmering designer gowns pointed at me, whispering behind their hands and shaking their heads. I was completely surrounded, trapped in a tight circle of privileged cruelty. I ignored the drunk cousin entirely. Instead, I lifted my gaze and looked straight across the massive ballroom, cutting through the sea of laughing faces, until my eyes locked onto the head table. I looked directly at Leo. He was sitting less than 50 feet away. He had a perfect, unobstructed view of the harassment unfolding at my table. He saw the cousin slamming the napkin down. He saw the guests pointing and laughing. For one fleeting second, our eyes met across the room. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for the brother I had sacrificed my entire youth for to finally show a single ounce of backbone. Instead, Leo swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He quickly looked down at his plate, picking up his fork and aimlessly pushing his food around. Then he physically turned his chair slightly to the right, angling his body away from me so he would not have to watch. He chose to stare at the blank ballroom wall rather than look at his own sister. That was it. That simple, cowardly shift of his shoulders was the exact moment the last remaining thread of my familial loyalty completely snapped. The boy I had protected from the world was officially gone, replaced by a spineless shell of a man who cared more about his country club status than the blood running through his veins. I felt a sudden icy calm wash over my entire body. There was no more guilt. There was no more hesitation. I was completely free. The cousin tapped the gold pen aggressively against the napkin, breaking my intense focus. "Come on, cleaning lady," he taunted. leaning in closer so his bourbon-laced breath hit my face. "We do not have all night. Do you need me to read the contract to you, or can you spell your own name?" I looked up at him, my expression completely blank and devoid of any fear. I slowly reached out and took the gold fountain pen from his outstretched hand. The crowd around the table suddenly fell silent, leaning in with eager anticipation. They genuinely expected me to either burst into tears and run out the kitchen doors, or sign the napkin in a pathetic attempt to play along with their cruel joke. I smoothed the crumpled linen napkin out on the table, flattening the creases with the palm of my hand. Uncapping the pen, I did not write my name. I did not write an angry message or a plea for mercy. Instead, with perfectly steady handwriting, I wrote down a very specific sequence of numbers. First, a 9-digit banking routing number. Right below that, a 10-digit corporate account number. When I was finished, I placed the cap back on the pen, set it down neatly beside my glass, and slid the napkin across the table toward the cousin. He picked it up, his drunken smirk faltering as his eyes scanned the numbers. He squinted, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to process the string of digits. He turned the napkin sideways, thinking he was misreading my handwriting. "What is this?" he asked, his loud voice dropping into a confused, frustrated mutter. "I told you to sign your name. What are these numbers?" He picked it up, his drunken smirk faltering as his eyes scanned the numbers. He squinted, his alcohol-addled brain struggling to process the string of digits. He turned the napkin sideways, thinking he was misreading my handwriting. "What is this?" he asked, his loud voice dropping into a confused, frustrated mutter. "I told you to sign your name. What are these numbers?" Before I could answer, a loud, sharp crash echoed from the very front of the ballroom, completely shattering the tense atmosphere around my table. The massive, heavy oak security doors at the main entrance were shoved open with such force that they banged loudly against the interior walls. The sudden noise was so startling that half the room literally jumped in their seats. The soft string music that the quartet had just restarted screeched to an immediate halt. I looked past the drunk cousin, past the sea of confused faces, and focused on the grand entrance. A group of 5 men had just breached the perimeter of the private event. They were not dressed in festive tuxedos or celebratory gowns. They wore sharp, immaculate, custom-tailored business suits that screamed aggressive corporate power. The head wedding coordinator, the same woman who had escorted me to the kitchen doors earlier, was frantically backpedaling in front of them, looking absolutely terrified. "Sir, you cannot be in here," she shouted, waving her tablet defensively as she tried to physically block the path of the man leading the group. "This is a private closed event. The Caldwell wedding is completely shut down to the public. I am going to have to call hotel security right now if you do not step back into the lobby." The man at the front of the group did not even break his stride. He did not look at her, nor did he acknowledge her threat. He simply raised one hand, a silent commanding gesture, and 2 of the men flanking him instantly stepped forward smoothly but firmly, moving the panicked coordinator completely out of the way. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The sheer audacity of the intrusion was shocking to a room full of people who were used to exclusive, untouchable privacy. The guests sitting near the front began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they were witnessing a security threat or a bizarre stunt. Up on the stage, Richard Caldwell was visibly furious. His triumphant moment, his grand display of power and charity at my expense, had been rudely interrupted. He glared at the entrance, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He gripped the microphone tightly, clearly preparing to unleash a torrent of wealthy entitlement upon the intruders. He hated having the spotlight stolen from him, especially in front of 500 people he was desperately trying to impress. "Security." Richard barked into the microphone, his voice echoing aggressively through the large hall. "I want security in here right this second. Who let these people pass the velvet ropes? This is a private family event. Remove them immediately." But the men did not stop. They walked with absolute terrifying purpose down the center aisle of the ballroom, their polished shoes sinking into the thick carpet. They completely ignored the angry muttering of the guests and the loud demands of the Caldwell patriarch. I sat back in my chair at table 40, my posture perfectly straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched the scene unfold with quiet, immense satisfaction. The drunk cousin beside me had completely forgotten about the napkin in his hand, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the men marching down the aisle. Richard stepped forward to the very edge of the stage, his chest puffed out in a display of aggressive dominance. He raised his free hand ready to shout another order to the hotel staff. But as the group of men stepped out of the shadows of the entrance and into the bright, focused light of the chandeliers, Richard suddenly froze. His angry, flushed face drained of all color in less than a second. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The aggressive posture melted away, replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock. He slowly lowered the microphone, his hands beginning to tremble visibly under the bright stage lights. He squinted as if hoping his eyes were playing a cruel trick on him. But they were not. The man leading the group stopped halfway down the aisle. He stood tall and unbothered, exuding an aura of absolute control. The ballroom was so quiet now that the sound of ice clinking in the glasses seemed deafening. Richard swallowed hard, recognizing the man who had just crashed his daughter's wedding. The man standing in the center aisle was none other than David Mitchell. At 50 years old, David was an absolute Wall Street legend. He was the chief executive officer of Apex Capital, the most ruthless, aggressive, and wildly successful venture capital firm on the entire eastern seaboard. He was a man explicitly known for tearing legacy corporations apart, liquidating their assets, and swallowing them whole before breakfast. He wore a charcoal gray bespoke suit that commanded immediate authority. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his sharp, calculating eyes scanned the opulent room with the cold precision of a predator, assessing a flock of very expensive sheep. Flanking David were 4 top-tier corporate litigators. These were not men who attended social events to drink champagne. They carried thick leather briefcases instead of wedding gifts, and their expressions were entirely devoid of any celebratory warmth. The angry flush in Richard Caldwell's face instantly vanished. The heavy redness was replaced first by an ashen panic, and then rapidly morphed into a frantic, hyperactive joy. His entire physical posture transformed right before our eyes. He went from an aggressive, territorial patriarch demanding blind obedience from the room to a desperately eager, sycophantic subordinate. He quickly set the microphone down on the wooden podium, completely forgetting about his grand speech, the 500 confused guests, and the fact that he was supposed to be giving his only daughter away. Nobody in that sprawling ballroom knew the actual truth, except for me and the men standing in the aisle. The Caldwell family legacy that Richard had just spent 10 minutes boasting about was a complete and utter fabrication. Caldwell Tech was bleeding cash at an uncontrollable rate. They were drowning in over $40 million of toxic corporate debt. For the past 6 months, Richard had been secretly begging Apex Capital for a $50 million bailout loan. Without that massive injection of capital, his company would be seized by creditors, and the Caldwell family would lose their mansions, their luxury cars, and their pristine country club memberships. He had sent endless frantic emails, made desperate late-night phone calls, and even offered up significant company equity, all of which had been met with cold, agonizing silence from David Mitchell's corporate office. But Richard was a deeply narcissistic man. Seeing the legendary CEO standing in the middle of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom, his mind immediately jumped to the most convenient self-aggrandizing conclusion possible. He actually believed David Mitchell had finally reviewed his desperate financial proposal, loved it, and decided to personally deliver the good news at the Caldwell family's most public and extravagant event. He genuinely thought David was there to sign the $50 million lifeline and celebrate their brand new corporate partnership in front of New York's elite. He viewed this as the ultimate validation of his own business genius. Richard practically leaped off the edge of the stage, aggressively smoothing down the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. He shoved a passing waiter completely out of his way and marched down the center aisle, pasting on the widest, most desperate smile I had ever seen. David, what an absolute honor, Richard called out loudly, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom. He stretched out both of his hands as he rapidly approached the group of executives. You could have called my assistant to tell me you were coming. I would have had my private security team escort you in through the VIP entrance. I cannot believe you actually came down here to celebrate with us. This is truly a historic day for Caldwell Tech and the Caldwell family. Back at the head table, Brenda Caldwell sat up perfectly straight, her eyes widening as she recognized the name of the billionaire standing in the aisle. She quickly elbowed Simone, whispering furiously into her daughter's ear. Simone's confused frown instantly melted into a radiant, camera-ready smile. She grabbed Leo by the arm and pulled him aggressively to his feet. Leo looked completely terrified. Richard had bragged to everyone that he had secured Leo a senior vice president role at Apex Capital, but looking at Leo's pale, sweating face, it was blatantly obvious he had never actually met the CEO of his supposed new employer. He stood awkwardly next to his bride, trying his hardest to look like a high-level executive, but instead, he just looked like a frightened little boy wearing a rented tuxedo. Richard finally closed the distance between the stage and the center aisle. He stopped right in front of David Mitchell, thrusting his right hand forward for an enthusiastic, triumphant handshake. The wealthy guests watched with bated breath, witnessing what they assumed was a massive corporate merger taking place right in the middle of a wedding reception. Richard was practically vibrating with excitement, his eyes shining with the desperate hope of a man who thought he had just been saved from total financial ruin. He had absolutely no idea that the titan of Wall Street standing in front of him did not work for himself. He had no idea that David Mitchell answered to exactly one person, and he had no idea that person was currently sitting at table 40, directly next to the kitchen doors, waiting to end his entire career. Richard pushed his hand forward with desperate enthusiasm, his heavy gold watch catching the chandelier light. He stood directly in David Mitchell's path, blocking the center aisle with his chest puffed out. The entire ballroom held its breath, watching the patriarch of the Caldwell family attempt to align himself with pure Wall Street royalty. Mr. Mitchell. Richard projected his voice loudly so the guests at the front tables could hear every word. I cannot tell you how much you honor my daughter's wedding with your presence tonight. We were just celebrating family, and now we can celebrate the future of Caldwell Tech. Please, let me have this catering director bring out our finest champagne. We have a private VIP suite upstairs where we can sit down, get away from the noise, and sign those final loan documents you brought. Richard pumped his arm, slightly eager for David to take his hand. He plastered a wide, confident grin across his face, playing the role of an equal. He expected David to smile back, grasp his hand firmly, and announce to the room that Apex Capital was officially saving his tech empire from complete financial ruin. But David Mitchell did not smile. He did not extend his arm. He did not even blink. Instead, David stopped walking and looked down at Richard's outstretched hand with an expression of sheer, unadulterated disgust. He looked at it the way someone might look at a piece of garbage that had blown onto their expensive shoes. The silence in the ballroom grew so heavy it felt suffocating. 10 seconds passed. Then 15. Richard's confident grin began to tremble at the corners. His arm remained suspended in the air, shaking slightly under the crushing weight of the public humiliation. David did not say a single word. He did not offer an excuse. He simply shifted his weight, stepped neatly to the side, and walked right around the panicked Caldwell patriarch. A collective gasp rippled through the front half of the ballroom. In the ruthless world of high society and corporate finance, completely ignoring a handshake in public was not just rude. It was a declaration of absolute war. It meant you did not respect the person, you did not acknowledge their status, and you certainly did not intend to do business with them. Richard spun around, his face suddenly glistening with cold sweat. His desperate joy evaporated instantly, replaced by sheer panic. He lunged forward, trying to keep up with David's long, purposeful strides. David, wait, Mr. Mitchell. Richard stammered, his voice cracking as his carefully constructed facade crumbled completely. Please, if this is about the equity percentage I offered in my last email, we can negotiate. I am willing to offer you a larger stake in the company. Just give me 5 minutes of your time to explain our revenue projections. One of the sharp-suited corporate litigators flanking David immediately stepped between them. He was a massive, imposing man who looked down at Richard with cold, dead eyes. "Step aside, Mr. Caldwell." The lawyer instructed, his tone low and dangerously flat. "Do not attempt to touch him again." Richard physically recoiled as if he had been violently slapped. He stood completely frozen in the middle of the aisle, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the opulent room. He looked at his wife, Brenda, whose arrogant posture had completely collapsed. She was gripping the edge of the head table, her knuckles stark white, her expensive emerald gown suddenly looking foolish. Simone was staring at her father in absolute horror, her designer wedding gown useless in the face of a corporate massacre. And Leo, my cowardly little brother, looked like he was about to pass out right into his dinner plate. David Mitchell ignored the unfolding Caldwell family meltdown. He stood near the front of the room, his piercing eyes scanning the sea of confused faces. He was not looking at the imported floral arrangements. He was not looking at the towering wedding cake. He was systematically searching the room for one specific person. I sat perfectly still at table 40, watching the Titan of Wall Street search for me. The drunk cousin who had tried to make me sign the napkin was now gripping the edge of my wobbly table, his mouth hanging open, as the alcohol slowly wore off in the face of sheer terror. He looked from the routing numbers I had written on the napkin to the group of ruthless executives standing in the aisle, his brain finally starting to connect the horrifying dots. The wealthy guests near the front began whispering frantically, wondering who the legendary CEO was looking for. Richard took another desperate step forward, convinced that David was simply confused by the massive crowd. David finally raised his chin. His cold, calculating eyes swept past the VIP tables, cut through the dimly lit middle section of the ballroom, and landed precisely on the darkest corner of the room. His gaze locked directly onto mine. The search was over. David did not hesitate for a single second after his eyes found mine. With the synchronized precision of a military unit, he and his 4 corporate litigators resumed their march. They bypassed the stunned figure of Richard Caldwell, entirely leaving the patriarch standing alone in the center aisle, with his hands still awkwardly suspended in the cold air. The sound of their polished leather shoes sinking into the thick carpet was the only noise echoing through the massive ballroom. 500 of New York's elite guests sat completely paralyzed, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their mouths, watching the most powerful man in finance walk straight past the most important tables in the room. David moved past table 1 and table 2, completely ignoring the extravagant floral centerpieces and the sea of wide-eyed faces. He did not spare a single glance for the head table where the bride and groom sat beneath their towering arch of imported orchids. Simone Caldwell watched him walk past, her perfect bridal smile completely vanishing. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, and leaned frantically toward her father. "Dad, what is he doing?" Simone whispered fiercely, her voice carrying sharply into the quiet room. "Dad, why is he ignoring us? Where is he going?" Richard could not answer her. He looked as though all the blood had been violently drained from his body. His mouth opened and closed silently, his eyes wide with a terrifying, uncomprehending panic. He watched the man who held his entire financial future in his hands walk away from the VIP section, away from the stage, and head directly toward the back of the room. Beside Simone, Leo was completely falling apart. The heavy stage lights illuminated the thick beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He aggressively wiped his face with a napkin, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. He had spent the entire evening boasting to the Caldwell family about his supposed connections, acting like he was a rising star in the corporate world. But as the CEO of his so-called employer walked right past him without a flicker of recognition, The fraudulent foundation of his entire new life began to violently crack. Leo shrank back into his chair, trying to make himself as small as possible, his eyes darting toward the exit doors as if calculating a way to escape. Brenda Caldwell was faring no better than her husband. The matriarch, who had just stood in the service hallway, demanding I leave the premises before the family photos, was now gripping her emerald silk gown in sheer terror. She looked from David Mitchell to the back of the room, her calculating mind desperately trying to piece together a puzzle that made absolutely no sense. Why would the most powerful investor in the city ignore a $50 million tech CEO to walk toward a woman she believed was nothing more than an uneducated maid? The sheer impossibility of the situation paralyzed her completely. She did not dare utter a single sound. The procession continued down the center aisle, moving from the brightly lit front half of the ballroom into the dimmer, less decorated sections. The guests sitting at tables 20 and 30 physically leaned back in their chairs as the group of men approached, unconsciously clearing a path. The severe, predatory expressions of the litigators warned anyone against saying a word or trying to intervene. The air grew thicker with every step they took. People craned their necks, desperately trying to see what could possibly be drawing a billionaire to the darkest corner of the room. They looked past the men following their trajectory, and their eyes eventually landed on me. I sat completely alone at the wobbly little table right next to the kitchen's swinging doors, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not shrink away from the attention. I kept my posture perfectly straight, meeting the hundreds of staring eyes with absolute, unwavering calm. The drunk cousin who had been harassing me just moments ago suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. The alcohol in his system seemed to evaporate instantly. He looked at the routing numbers I had written on the crumpled napkin, then looked up at the 5 imposing men bearing down on our location. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He dropped the gold fountain pen onto the table, took 3 rapid steps backward, and practically melted into the shadows near the restroom hallway, terrified of being caught in the crossfire. David Mitchell finally reached the very back of the room. The contrast was incredibly jarring. Here was a titan of industry, a man whose bespoke suit cost more than most people earned in a year, standing in the cramped, poorly lit space next to a stack of dirty serving trays and the sharp smell of kitchen grease. The fluorescent light from the kitchen doors spilled over his shoulders, casting long, dramatic shadows across the carpet. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of table 40. The 4 corporate litigators fanned out behind him, forming a human barricade that effectively blocked anyone from approaching. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the billionaire to speak to the woman they had all just spent the last 20 minutes mocking. David looked down at the tiny wobbly table. He looked at my simple navy dress, and then his eyes drifted to the stark white place card resting near my water glass. He read the elegant gold calligraphy, Nora, the housemaid. A muscle feathered in his jaw, betraying a flash of intense cold fury on my behalf. But he quickly composed himself, smoothing his expression back into a mask of absolute professionalism. He buttoned the center button of his suit jacket and took a deep breath, preparing to deliver a statement that would permanently alter the reality of everyone in that room. David Mitchell stopped exactly 2 feet in front of table 40, his 4 corporate litigators fanning out behind him to form an impenetrable wall. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the billionaire to speak to the woman they had all just spent the last 20 minutes mocking. David looked down at my wobbly table, his eyes taking in the stark white place card resting near my water glass. He read the elegant gold calligraphy, Nora, the housemaid. A muscle feathered in his jaw, betraying a flash of intense cold fury on my behalf. But he quickly composed himself, smoothing his expression back into a mask of absolute professionalism. He buttoned the center button of his charcoal gray suit jacket, took a deliberate step backward, and then did something that made 500 wealthy guests simultaneously stop breathing. David Mitchell, the titan of Wall Street, bowed. It was not a quick, polite nod of the head. It was a deep, formal, and profoundly respectful bow, the kind of gesture reserved exclusively for absolute superiors. He kept his eyes lowered, acknowledging my complete authority over him and everything he represented. Madam President David said, his deep, resonant voice easily carrying across the dead silent ballroom. I apologize for the intrusion, but the financial audit you requested is complete. Caldwell Tech is officially insolvent. Their debt-to-equity ratio is catastrophic. The hostile acquisition papers are completely finalized and are ready for your immediate signature. The words echoed off the high ceiling, cutting through the heavy air like a scythe. Insolvent. Hostile acquisition. Madam President. The wealthy guests sitting near the back tables physically recoiled, their eyes darting between me and the legendary CEO, desperately trying to make sense of a reality that had just inverted itself. I did not act surprised. I did not gloat. I simply nodded, my expression remaining completely calm and authoritative. "Thank you, David," I replied smoothly, my voice steady and clear. "I appreciate you bringing the documents to me personally." I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back from the wobbly table. I had worn a cheap, unflattering navy cardigan over my dress specifically to please my brother, to hide in the background, so his new family would not feel threatened. It was time to stop hiding. I unbuttoned the cheap cardigan, slipped it off my shoulders, and casually tossed it onto the empty chair. Without the bulky sweater, the true nature of my dress was instantly revealed. It was not a cheap off-the-rack uniform. It was a custom-tailored midnight blue designer gown that fit me with absolute striking perfection. It was the kind of garment that whispered wealth rather than screaming it, made from silk so fine it seemed to absorb the dim light. I stood tall, my shoulders pulled back, exuding the undeniable confidence of a woman who had built an empire from the ground up. David stepped forward and respectfully handed me a thick black leather binder embossed with the Apex Capital logo. I opened it, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted financial documents that detailed the absolute ruin of Richard Caldwell's life. Suddenly, the heavy silence was broken by the sound of frantic, heavy footsteps thudding against the carpet. Richard Caldwell had finally broken out of his frozen panic. He sprinted down the center aisle, pushing past a waiter who stumbled and nearly dropped a tray of champagne. Richard's face was flushed a dangerous mottled purple, his chest heaving as he skidded to a halt just outside the barricade of corporate lawyers. President Richard sputtered, his voice cracking wildly as he pointed a trembling finger at me. "David, what is this? What kind of sick joke are you playing? She is a maid. She used to clean toilets at a diner. She is my son-in-law's white trash sister." David did not flinch. He slowly turned his head to look at Richard, his expression radiating pure, unfiltered disgust. He looked at the Caldwell patriarch as if he were a particularly slow child who had just wandered into a boardroom. "You are a remarkably ignorant man, Richard," David stated, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Nora is not a maid. She is the anonymous founder and majority shareholder of Apex Capital. She personally built the firm from the ground up over the last 10 years. She owns my firm, which means as of the moment her legal team froze your accounts 10 minutes ago, she owns yours." Richard's mouth dropped open, his jaw practically unhinging. He looked from David's cold, serious face to me standing calmly with the leather binder in my hands. His mind desperately tried to reject the information, but the reality was completely undeniable. The woman he had just publicly humiliated, the woman he had offered a minimum-wage janitorial job to in front of 500 people, was the absolute ruler of the financial firm, holding his $50 million debt. I looked at Richard, letting him fully process the magnitude of his fatal mistake. "You should have checked your financial ledgers before you decided to check my pedigree, Richard," I said softly, closing the leather binder with a sharp, decisive snap. "Your company is bankrupt, your pension funds are drained, and your luxury lifestyle is officially over." Richard stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. The sharp, decisive snap of the leather binder seemed to break whatever spell had been holding him together. He bumped into one of the empty chairs at table 40, his knees buckling slightly, his face a mask of absolute, paralyzing horror. He had no counter-argument, he had no defense. He knew the numbers in that binder were real. Before Richard could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, a sudden commotion broke out near the center aisle. Someone was frantically shoving their way through the crowd of stunned guests. It was Leo. My brother practically sprinted the remaining distance to the back of the ballroom. He looked entirely derailed. The confident, arrogant groom from 20 minutes ago had completely vanished. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his face was so pale it practically matched the white table linens. He reached the human barricade of corporate litigators and stopped, panting heavily, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. David Mitchell glanced at me for direction. I gave a subtle nod and the lawyers parted just enough to let my brother step through. Leo stumbled forward, his hands trembling violently at his sides. He looked at the thick black binder in my hands, then up at David Mitchell, and finally his gaze locked onto mine. His mouth opened and closed several times before he could force any words out. Nora, Leo stammered, his voice thin and cracking with pure panic. Nora, what is he talking about? You own Apex Capital. But that is impossible. Brenda told me I got the senior vice president job because of Richard. She said Richard used his high-level connections to get me that position. I looked at the young man standing in front of me. I searched my heart for a single ounce of sympathy, a shred of the maternal instinct that had driven me to work 3 jobs to keep him fed. I found absolutely nothing. The well had run completely dry. I looked at my brother with zero warmth. My expression was as cold and unyielding as the marble floors of my corporate headquarters. Richard has no connections, Leo. I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet space. Richard Caldwell is a fraud, drowning in $40 million of corporate debt. He could not secure a job for a summer intern, let alone a senior executive position at a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. Leo flinched physically, stepping back as the reality of my words began to shatter his fragile ego. I created that position for you. I continued, my tone flat and clinical. The day you announced your engagement to Simone, I bypassed my own board of directors. I instructed Human Resources to draft an offer letter for a senior vice president role with a massive starting salary and a complete benefits package. I handed you the keys to the kingdom, Leo. But I did not put your name on the door just to give you a paycheck. I did it because I wanted to test you. Leo stared at me, his chest heaving, the realization of his own catastrophic failure slowly sinking into his bones. The 500 guests in the room watched in absolute silence, captivated by the devastating destruction of the groom. I wanted to see what kind of man you would become when you were finally handed real power, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. I wanted to see if the wealth would make you generous or if it would make you arrogant. I gave you the world to see if you would remember the sister who starved so you could eat. Instead, the second you thought you had money, you completely discarded me. You let your new family mock my poverty. You agreed to hide me in the darkest corner of this room, right next to the toilets, because you were ashamed of the very sacrifices that kept you alive. A choked sob escaped Leo's throat. He reached out a trembling hand toward me, his eyes pleading for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. Nora, please, he whispered frantically. I did not know. I swear I did not know you were the boss. I was just trying to fit in with them. That is exactly the point, Leo, I replied, my voice slicing through his pathetic excuses like a freshly sharpened blade. Your character should not depend on whether or not you know I am the boss. You should have defended me because I am your sister. You should have defended me because it was the right thing to do. But you showed your true colors tonight. You sold your soul for a seat at a table that does not even have any money to pay the bill. The devastating truth crashed down on Leo all at once. The prestigious job he had been bragging about all night was entirely controlled by the woman he had just publicly humiliated. The wealthy, elite family he had abandoned me for was actually completely bankrupt. He had traded absolute loyalty for a glittering illusion, and now he was left with absolutely nothing. He fell to his knees right there on the carpet, burying his face in his hands, as a loud, agonizing sob tore through his chest. I did not offer my brother a comforting hand. I stepped carefully around his shaking shoulders, leaving him kneeling on the floor, and turned my attention to the front of the room. It was time to finish what Richard Caldwell had started. With a slight gesture of my hand, David Mitchell and the 4 corporate litigators fell into step behind me. We began our walk toward the main stage. The transformation of the ballroom was absolute. Just 20 minutes ago, these 500 guests had been laughing at me, pointing fingers, and treating me like an amusing piece of trash that had blown in from the street. Now, as I walked down the center aisle, the crowd physically parted like the Red Sea. Men in expensive tuxedos quickly pulled their wives back, clearing a wide path. Nobody dared to make eye contact with me. The heavy silence was broken only by the sharp, authoritative click of my heels against the polished floorboards near the stage. I climbed the short flight of stairs to the raised platform, moving with deliberate, unhurried grace. I walked directly to the wooden podium where Richard had delivered his arrogant speech just moments before. The microphone was still sitting exactly where he had abandoned it in his frantic rush to greet David. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal in my hand, and turned to face the sprawling room. I placed the thick black leather binder from Apex Capital directly onto the podium and flipped it open. "Thank you all for your patience," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the massive speakers, completely steady and devoid of the nervous tremor that Richard had displayed. Earlier this evening, Richard Caldwell stood on this exact spot and spoke to you about the Caldwell family legacy. He boasted about their generational wealth. He spoke about excellence and unlimited resources. He even graciously offered me a minimum wage job out of the goodness of his heart. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over the VIP tables. Richard was still standing frozen near the back aisle, his face ashen. Brenda was gripping the edge of the head table, looking completely nauseous. I looked back down at the heavily redacted financial documents illuminated by the small podium light. Unfortunately, I continued my tone, shifting from polite to razor-sharp. It seems Richard's definition of legacy is entirely fictional. I hold in my hands the finalized certified financial audit of Caldwell Tech, conducted by my firm, Apex Capital. And because Richard was so eager to share my personal financial history with all of you, I feel it is only fair to share his in return. The Caldwell family is not old money. In fact, as of this morning, they do not have any money at all. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The socialites and executives who had been praising the Caldwells all night suddenly looked horrified. I tapped the open page of the binder for emphasis. Caldwell Tech is currently carrying $40 million in toxic corporate debt, I announced clearly, ensuring every single syllable hit the back walls of the hall. They have been entirely insolvent for over 8 months. Their corporate accounts are overdrawn. Their credit lines have been completely frozen by every major bank in New York. They do not dictate the market as Richard so proudly claimed. They are bankrupt. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the sprawling estates are all heavily mortgaged illusions. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, filled with sudden outrage and disbelief. But I was not finished. I turned the page in the binder, exposing the most damning piece of evidence my forensic accountants had uncovered. But the most interesting part of this audit, I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through the rising noise, is how this spectacular $1 million wedding was actually funded. Because it certainly was not paid for by a family trust fund. According to these bank routing numbers, Richard Caldwell authorized a massive illegal wire transfer 3 weeks ago. He drained the employee pension funds of his own company. He stole the retirement savings of his hardworking staff just to buy imported white roses and designer champagne so he could keep up appearances for all of you. The ballroom exploded. The polite whispers instantly turned into shouts of absolute outrage. Many of the guests in the room were not just social acquaintances. They were investors, board members, and business partners who now realized they were tied to a massive federal crime. Embezzling employee pensions was not just poor business management. It was a severe felony that carried a heavy prison sentence. I looked over at the head table. Simone Caldwell looked like she was going to be physically sick. Her perfect, arrogant demeanor was entirely shattered. The glamorous life she thought she was living had just been exposed as a criminal facade in front of everyone she desperately wanted to impress. The elite society she worshipped was turning on her family in real time. I leaned closer to the microphone, delivering the final crushing blow. You called me a charity case, Richard. You mocked my background to elevate your own status. But I earned every single dollar I possess with my own two hands. You stole yours from the people who trusted you. The facade is over. The echo of my words faded into a stunned, suffocating silence. Then a sharp, heavy thud broke the quiet. Simone Caldwell stood at the head table, her face entirely drained of its arrogant glow. Her hands had gone completely slack, dropping her massive, custom-designed, cascading bouquet of imported white orchids directly onto the polished wooden floor. The delicate petals bruised and scattered across the floorboards, a perfect visual representation of her shattered reality. She ignored the ruined flowers and turned violently toward her father. Dad, Simone shrieked, her perfectly modulated socialite voice completely breaking into a frantic, high-pitched wail. Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is just some horrible, tasteless prank. You promised me this wedding was fully paid for. You promised me my trust fund was secure. Are you telling me I am broke? That we are all completely broke? Richard could not even look his own daughter in the eye. He stared blankly at the floor, his broad shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, looking 20 years older than he had just half an hour ago. His silence was the ultimate devastating confirmation. Simone let out a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed the edge of the head table and aggressively swept her arm across the pristine white linen, sending crystal champagne flutes, silver charger plates, and expensive floral arrangements crashing to the ground. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed like gunfire through the ballroom. Guests sitting in the front row flinched some, quickly standing up and backing away from the spectacular, explosive implosion of the bride. "You humiliated me," she screamed at her parents, her face flushed with fury. "You paraded me in front of all my wealthy friends, knowing we were entirely bankrupt. You let me plan $1 million wedding with stolen money. I am going to be the laughingstock of the entire city because of you." Her frantic eyes darted around the massive room, desperately searching for a lifeboat in the middle of her sinking reality. Her gaze snapped to my brother, who was still kneeling weakly on the carpet near the center aisle, crying into his hands. Simone lifted her heavy silk skirts and marched down the steps of the dais toward him. She did not look at her new husband with love, sympathy, or concern. She looked at him like a broken ATM machine she desperately needed to withdraw cash from. "Leo, get up," Simone snapped, grabbing the lapels of his expensive rented tuxedo and trying to forcefully haul him to his feet. "Get up right now and stop crying like a child. You are a senior vice president at Apex Capital. You make an exorbitant amount of money. You have an elite corporate expense account. You need to call your bank immediately and transfer funds to my father's accounts. You have to fix this mess tonight." Leo just stared up at her, his eyes red and swollen, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, raspy breath came out. He knew the truth, but he was entirely incapable of explaining it to his furious bride. Furious at his lack of immediate action, Simone let go of his tuxedo, letting him slump back onto the floor. She turned her blazing eyes back to me. She marched right up to the edge of the stage where I stood behind the podium, completely blinded by her own panicked entitlement. In her desperate state of denial, she conveniently forgot that David Mitchell had just formally bowed to me. She forgot that I was holding the financial execution orders for her family. She only remembered the arrogant narrative she and her mother had spun earlier in the hallway. "Listen to me, you miserable woman," Simone sneered, pointing a trembling, manicured finger up at me. "I do not care what kind of fake documents you brought in here to ruin my perfect night. You might think you have some sort of power because you stole a binder, but you are absolutely nothing. My husband is a top executive at Apex Capital. He is going to be running that company one day. I am the wife of a Wall Street titan now, and we are going to use his incredible corporate salary to rebuild my family's empire." She placed her hands on her hips, lifting her chin in a pathetic attempt to reassert her dominance. "We do not need your pity," Simone declared loudly, her voice dripping with venom. "And we certainly do not need a glorified diner maid standing at a podium acting like she owns the place. You are just jealous because Leo chose high society over the trailer park. Now get off my stage before I have my husband's security team throw you out." The sheer breathtaking delusion of her rant echoed through the silent ballroom. David Mitchell, standing just behind my right shoulder, let out a low, dark scoff of absolute disbelief. The four corporate litigators shook their heads, almost embarrassed for her. Simone was desperately clinging to a fabricated financial lifeline that I had personally woven, completely oblivious to the terrifying fact that I was currently holding the scissors directly over the thread. I did not raise my voice to match Simone's hysterical screaming. I did not need to. Not need. I had the microphone, I had the truth, and I had David Mitchell standing behind me as the ultimate executioner. I looked down at the furious bride, whose face was contorted with a mixture of rage and absolute denial, and I let out a short, hollow laugh. It was the only time I had broken my entirely stoic demeanor all evening, and the sound of it echoing through the massive ballroom made several guests physically flinch. "Simone," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm, "you are operating under a catastrophic misunderstanding of how the corporate world works. Your husband does not have a security team. Your husband does not have executive power. And your husband certainly is not going to be running Apex Capital one day." I shifted my gaze from the frantic bride to my brother. Leo was still kneeling on the carpet near the center aisle, his hands gripping his hair in absolute despair. He knew exactly what was coming. He knew the axe was about to fall, and there was absolutely nowhere for him to hide. The entire room fell into a breathless silence, waiting for the final blow. "Leo doesn't have a salary," I stated coldly into the mic, making sure every single person in the room heard the finality in my tone. "Leo, you abandoned the sister who starved so you could eat. You chose the shiny veneer of high society over the blood that kept you alive. You wanted to play the role of a ruthless executive, but you do not possess a single ounce of the integrity required to sit at my table. You are officially terminated from Apex Capital, effective immediately. Let's see how much your new family loves you when you're as broke as they are." The words struck him like physical blows. Leo let out a pathetic guttural gasp, his chest caving inward as the reality of his termination washed over him. The illusion was completely shattered. He was no longer the golden boy. He was no longer the wealthy savior of the Caldwell family. He was just an unemployed, uneducated fraud who had just been publicly fired by his own sister in front of 1,000 people. The reaction from Simone was immediate and entirely visceral. The moment I announced Leo was terminated and broke, her entire demeanor shifted. She did not reach down to comfort her new husband. She did not kneel beside him to offer support or promise that they would get through this disaster together. Instead, she took a massive, horrified step backward, pulling her expensive designer wedding gown away from him as if his sudden poverty was a highly contagious disease. She looked down at Leo with an expression of sheer, unadulterated disgust. The transactional nature of their relationship was exposed for the entire room to see. She had only married him because she thought he was her financial lifeboat, a wealthy executive who could secretly plug the holes in her father's sinking ship. Now that she realized he was just as bankrupt as her own family, he was entirely useless to her. "You idiot, Simone," hissed down at him, her voice trembling with rage. "You told us you were a self-made man. You told us you earned that position. You dragged me into this mess, and you have absolutely nothing." Leo looked up at her, his face streaked with tears, his hands shaking violently. "Simone, please," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you. We are married. We can figure this out." But Simone just scoffed, turning her back on him completely. She looked toward her mother, Brenda, who was still clutching the edge of the head table, looking completely paralyzed. The Caldwell women were trapped. Their grand scheme to use my brother for his supposed wealth had backfired with spectacular, devastating precision. They had mocked my cheap dress and my history of hard labor, completely blind to the fact that their own survival depended entirely on the paycheck I provided. I stood at the podium and watched the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth for grovel at the feet of a woman who clearly despised him. For 16 years I had worked graveyard shifts, scrubbed toilets, and worn holes in my shoes just to make sure he never felt the cold sting of rejection. I had protected him from the harsh realities of the world, absorbing every blow so he could walk away unscathed. But tonight I was no longer his shield. I had stripped away the unearned armor I had built for him, leaving him completely exposed to the ruthless transactional nature of the family he had chosen over me. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. The termination was not just about removing him from my company. It was about officially severing the invisible chain that had bound me to his ungrateful existence for my entire adult life. He was no longer my responsibility. He was just a stranger crying on the floor. My attention shifted back to the man who had orchestrated this entire circus. Richard Caldwell was standing near the edge of the VIP tables, but he no longer looked like the imposing, arrogant patriarch of a wealthy dynasty. The heavy, suffocating reality of his situation had finally crushed the last remaining breath of his ego. The investors and board members sitting at the front tables were already pulling out their phones, frantically calling their own legal teams and wealth managers. Some were standing up, throwing their napkins onto their plates in absolute disgust, preparing to leave the tainted venue before the authorities arrived. Richard saw his empire evaporating in real time. He saw his daughter shrieking at a penniless groom. He saw the heavy iron doors of federal prison swinging wide open to swallow him whole. Desperation is a fascinating thing to witness in a man who has spent his entire life believing he is entirely untouchable. It strips away all pretense, leaving only a raw, primal panic. Nora Richard gasped, his voice barely recognizable. He stumbled forward, pushing past the empty chairs and the shattered crystal on the floor. He moved with the frantic, uncoordinated heavy steps of a drowning man. He reached the bottom of the short staircase leading up to the stage, directly below where I stood at the podium. David Mitchell stepped forward instinctively to block him, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling my lead executive to stand down. I wanted to hear exactly what Richard had to say. Richard did not walk up the stairs. Instead, right there in the middle of the Waldorf Astoria ballroom, in front of 500 elite guests, his own family, and the executives he had spent years trying to impress, the 58-year-old CEO completely collapsed. He dropped heavily onto his knees. The loud thud of his kneecaps hitting the polished wooden floorboards echoed sharply through the room. He clasped his hands together, tilting his head back to look up at me. His face was soaked in sweat and tears, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like a pathetic clown suit. "Please," Richard begged, his voice cracking wildly as he openly sobbed. "Please, Madam President, I am begging you. Do not let them send me to prison. I will give you everything. I will sign over 100% equity of Caldwell Tech tonight. You can have the entire company, the patents, the remaining hardware, the headquarters, absolutely everything. Just assume the corporate debt. Just absorb the pension deficit so the federal authorities do not indict me. I made a terrible mistake. I was just trying to keep my family afloat. I will walk away with nothing. Just please let me walk away free." The sheer pathetic nature of his plea made my stomach turn. He was not apologizing for stealing millions of dollars from his hardworking employees. He was not apologizing for publicly humiliating me and trying to force me to clean his toilets just to get a laugh from his country club friends. He was only crying because he had been caught by someone holding a bigger checkbook. He was willing to sell his entire legacy for a get-out-of-jail-free card. I looked down at the kneeling man. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Every single person was waiting for my verdict. I reached into the small, elegant clutch resting next to the thick leather binder on the podium. My fingers brushed against the crumpled white linen napkin that Simone's drunk cousin had slammed onto my wobbly table just half an hour ago. I pulled it out, holding it up so the bright stage lights illuminated the fabric. I could still see the bank routing numbers I had written across the front. I walked around the wooden podium and stepped down the short staircase, stopping just inches away from where Richard was kneeling on the floor. He looked at the napkin, his tear-filled eyes darting back up to my face in complete confusion. I let go of the linen. The napkin fluttered through the air, drifting down slowly until it landed right on the floor directly between Richard's knees. I do not need your equity, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that carried absolute, unwavering authority. Your company is completely worthless. I will buy your remaining assets for pennies on the dollar in federal bankruptcy court tomorrow morning. You have nothing of value to offer me. You are going to face the federal investigators, you are going to answer for the pensions you stole, and you are going to prison. Richard let out a strangled, breathless whine, staring down at the napkin as if it were a literal death warrant. However, I continued, my tone completely merciless. I did read the employment contract your family was so eager for me to sign tonight. And since I will be taking ownership of your corporate headquarters tomorrow, I am going to need someone to scrub the toilets on the executive floor. Consider it my wedding gift to you. You can start on Monday. Richard remained trembling on the floor, weeping over the crumpled napkin. The sheer finality of my offer hung heavy in the silent ballroom. Seeing her husband utterly defeated and her daughter completely unhinged, Brenda Caldwell realized that their aggressive intimidation tactics had spectacularly failed. The Caldwell matriarch, who had spent the entire evening radiating venom and absolute superiority, recognized that her empire was slipping through her fingers. She had one last card to play. She released her white-knuckled grip on the head table and began to move. She did not stomp or shriek like her daughter Simone. Brenda walked slowly toward the stage, her heavy emerald silk gown rustling softly against the carpet. As she approached, her face underwent a terrifyingly seamless transformation. The cold, calculating sneer she had worn in the hallway melted away entirely. In its place, she summoned the wide, tear-filled eyes of a desperate, loving mother. She stopped at the bottom of the wooden stairs, standing right next to her sobbing husband, and looked up at me with an expression of perfectly manufactured heartbreak. She clasped her hands tightly together over her chest, pressing her heavy diamond tennis bracelet into her collarbone, as if trying to hold her shattering heart together. "Nora, please just listen to me for one moment," Brenda pleaded, her voice trembling with beautifully executed emotion. "I know we got off on the wrong foot tonight. I know I said some incredibly harsh and unforgivable things to you earlier, but you have to try and understand where I was coming from. I am a mother, Nora. When I look at Leo, I do not see a stranger. I see a young man who has been through so much pain and trauma in his early life. I see a boy who just desperately needed a chance to succeed. We only wanted to give him the world. We wanted to give him the stability, the financial security, and the high society connections that he so deeply craved. We honestly thought we were helping him build a beautiful future." She took a slow step closer to the stage, letting a single tragic tear slip down her perfectly powdered cheek. "We are all family now, Nora," she said, her voice softening into a desperate whisper that echoed through the microphone on my podium. "You, me, Richard, Simone, and Leo. We are forever bound together by this marriage. Families fight. Families make terrible mistakes. But at the end of the day, families protect each other. You raised that boy from the time he was a child. You know how much this wedding and this new life meant to him. If you destroy Caldwell Tech tonight, you are not just punishing Richard for a financial mistake. You are completely destroying Leo's new family. You are destroying his happiness and his future. I am begging you as one mother figure to another, please do not tear our family apart. Let us work together to fix this terrible misunderstanding." I stood quietly at the podium and watched her perform. It was a brilliant masterclass in emotional manipulation. If I had been the insecure, desperate girl from the trailer park she assumed I was, her tears might have actually worked. But I was the woman who built Apex Capital from scratch, and I could spot a fraudulent pitch from a mile away. Her sudden invocation of the family bond was nothing more than a desperate, pathetic bargaining chip to save her mansion, her designer wardrobe, and her exclusive country club status. I leaned slightly closer to the microphone, making sure my voice would carry to every single person in the ballroom who was watching this pathetic display. I cut her off before she could squeeze out another fake tear. "Do not, you dare invoke the word family to me, Brenda," I said, my voice sharp, cold, and entirely unyielding. Half an hour ago in the service corridor, you looked me directly in the eyes and told me I was nothing but a temporary caretaker. You told me my shift was officially over. You explicitly demanded that I leave this venue and call a cab before the photographer arrived because you were terrified my trailer park dirt would rub off on your pristine daughter. Brenda flinched violently. Her fake tears instantly dried up as her own vicious elitist words were broadcast loudly to the entire room of her wealthy peers. Her jaw dropped slightly, her carefully constructed mask of maternal warmth shattering into a million pieces. You wanted to wash the poverty off his hands? I continued staring her down with absolute unfiltered disgust. Well, congratulations, Brenda. You succeeded. You stripped away his loyalty, you stripped away his dignity, and now I have officially stripped away his bank account. You do not want a family. You want a wealthy hostage you can parade around to your country club friends to hide your own catastrophic debt. I am not going to save your fraudulent empire, and I am certainly not going to fund your endless delusions of grandeur. Keep your pristine family. You are all morally bankrupt and you absolutely deserve each other. Brenda stepped back, her face crumpling as she finally realized there was no manipulating her way out of this nightmare. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, her shoulders shaking as she retreated into the shadows of the head table. She was completely defeated. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my statement was violently shattered by the sound of tearing fabric. Down on the floor near the center aisle, Simone had grabbed the heavy layers of her designer wedding gown and yanked them up aggressively, stepping away from Leo. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure ugly rage. She looked at the man she had just exchanged sacred vows with less than 2 hours ago, as if he were a highly infectious disease. "You lied to me!" Simone shrieked, her voice cracking as she pointed a sharp manicured finger right in his face. "You sat at my family dinner table and let us believe you were a self-made corporate success. You let me brag to all of my wealthy friends that I was marrying a senior executive at Apex Capital. But you are absolutely nothing. You are a penniless fraud who used my father and his connections to try and play dress-up in a world you do not belong in. And now you do not even have a job to fall back on." Leo reached out his shaking hands, tears streaming down his pale face. "Simone, please," he begged, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "I did it because I loved you. I wanted to be good enough for your family. We can start over. We can figure this out together." Simone let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed painfully through the ballroom. "Start over with what?" She spat, her eyes blazing with absolute contempt. "I did not sign up to marry an unemployed loser. I did not sign up for a life of poverty." With a violent, aggressive jerk of her hand, she grabbed the massive 3-carat diamond engagement ring off her finger. She did not politely hand it back to him. She reared her arm back and threw it directly at his chest with all her might. The heavy diamond ring hit his tuxedo shirt with a dull thud before bouncing off and rolling away across the polished wooden floorboards, disappearing under a guest table. The grand $1 million marriage was officially over before the caterers had even served the main course. Leo looked down at the empty floor where the ring had landed, his entire body trembling uncontrollably. He had lost his beautiful bride. He had lost his elite new family. He had lost the high society life he had eagerly sold his soul to obtain. Slowly he lifted his heavy head and looked past Simone, his red, swollen eyes locking onto me, standing safely behind the podium. He knew there was only one person left in the entire world who had the power and the resources to save him. He pushed himself off the carpet, stumbling forward blindly until he reached the bottom of the stage stairs, collapsing right next to where Richard Caldwell was still kneeling in defeat. "Nora," Leo cried out, his voice breaking into a desperate, agonizing sob that made several guests physically look away. "Nora, I am so sorry. I was stupid. I was blind. I let the money and the expensive clothes and the country club parties completely change me. But I am still your brother. Please do not do this to me. Do not leave me with absolutely nothing. I have nowhere else to go." I reached up and gripped the edges of the wooden podium, looking down at him from the stage. My face remained an impenetrable mask of solid ice. Seeing that his desperate apologies were bouncing right off my hardened exterior, Leo reached for the deepest, most sacred emotional weapon he had left in his arsenal. He looked up at me, tears pouring down his cheeks, and he used the name he had not called me since he was 10 years old. "Please, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying raw vulnerability. "Please. You promised you would always take care of me. You promised you would never let me fall. Please, Mom, I need you. I need you to save me." A collective gasp rippled through the wealthy guests who were sitting close enough to hear his plea. The sheer emotional weight of that single word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. 16 years ago, that word would have made me drop absolutely everything. It would have made me empty my bank account, skip my own meals, and work myself into the ground just to see him smile. But tonight, standing in the middle of his ruined wedding, the word fell completely flat. It did not pierce my heart. It did not summon a single ounce of maternal instinct. I looked at the weeping man at the bottom of the stairs, feeling nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. "The boy who used to call me Mom died a long time ago," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "He died the moment he decided he was too embarrassed to claim me. He died the moment he let his new family mock my poverty. He died the moment he printed a card that called me a housemaid and hid me by the kitchen doors. I kept my promise, Leo. I took care of you until you were old enough to stand on your own 2 feet. But you decided to walk away. You made your bed with these terrible people. Now you are going to lie in it." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply reached out and closed the thick black leather binder with a sharp echoing snap. The sharp echoing snap of the leather binder signaled the absolute end of the Caldwell dynasty. I did not look back down at Leo, who was now weeping silently into the carpet, nor did I spare another glance for Richard or Brenda. Their fates were sealed, and my part in their destruction was entirely complete. I turned to my right, facing David Mitchell, who had stood like a silent sentinel throughout the entire execution. I extended my hand, offering him the microphone. David took it with a single respectful nod. "I am leaving now." I told him, my voice quiet but firm enough to carry to the front rows. "Have the legal team secure the perimeter. I want the bankruptcy filings submitted to the federal judge the second the courthouse opens tomorrow morning. Ensure the authorities are fully briefed on the pension embezzlement by midnight." "Consider it done," Madam President David replied, his tone radiating absolute competence. "Enjoy your evening." I stepped away from the wooden podium and descended the short staircase. The ballroom, which had been buzzing with cruel laughter and arrogant chatter just an hour ago, was now trapped in a suffocating funeral silence. 500 of New York's wealthiest elite stood completely paralyzed. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the crowd intuitively reacted. Men in expensive tuxedos and women in shimmering designer gowns physically stepped backward, practically climbing over their own chairs to clear a wide, unobstructed path for me. They lowered their eyes, terrified that making eye contact might somehow draw my financial crosshairs onto their own inherited wealth. I walked down the center aisle with slow, deliberate grace. The heavy silence was broken only by the rhythmic click of my heels against the polished floorboards. I passed the head table where the shattered crystal and bruised orchids lay scattered like casualties of a war the Caldwells never stood a chance of winning. I passed the groomsmen, who were staring at the floor in sheer embarrassment. I passed the drunk cousin who had tried to force me to sign the napkin. He had plastered himself against a decorative pillar, looking as though he wanted to physically merge with the wallpaper to escape my notice. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation washing over me with every step I took toward the exit. For 16 years, I had carried the crushing weight of my brother's survival on my shoulders. I had allowed his insecurities to dictate my wardrobe, my presence, and my own sense of self-worth. I had hidden my success to protect his fragile ego. But walking down that aisle, I shed the identity of the sacrificial sister completely. I was no longer the martyr. I was the architect of my own empire. As I approached the back of the ballroom, heading toward the massive oak security doors, my eyes landed on the centerpiece of the Caldwell family's fraudulent celebration. It was a lavish 7-tier wedding cake standing nearly 5 feet tall on a silver pedestal. It was an extravagant masterpiece of white fondant, draped in edible gold leaf, and hundreds of handcrafted sugar roses. It was the ultimate symbol of their desperate need to project an illusion of unlimited wealth. I stopped walking. The entire room collectively held its breath, watching my every move. I altered my course slightly, walking past the towering cake, and heading straight for table 40, the tiny wobbly table hidden by the kitchen doors, where they had attempted to bury me. The table was exactly as I had left it. I reached out and picked up the stark white place card resting next to my water glass. The elegant gold calligraphy gleamed under the dim fluorescent lighting. Nora, the housemaid. I held the heavy cardstock in my hand, feeling the raised ink beneath my thumb. I turned around and walked slowly back to the towering wedding cake. Simone Caldwell let out a distant, muffled gasp from the front of the room, but nobody dared to step forward or say a word to stop me. I stood in front of the massive dessert, admiring the sheer arrogance of its design. Without a single trace of hesitation, I raised my hand and plunged the thick place card directly into the pristine white frosting of the very top tier. I pushed it deep into the cake, ensuring it stood perfectly upright, replacing the traditional bride and groom topper with a definitive statement of my own. The gold letters of the housemaid faced the entire ballroom, a glaring permanent reminder of the fatal mistake that had cost them their entire world. I wiped a small smudge of white frosting from my thumb using one of the linen napkins on a nearby tray. Then, without looking back at the wreckage of the family that had tried to destroy me, I pushed open the heavy oak security doors and stepped out into the quiet, brightly lit lobby of the hotel. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating tension of the ballroom, leaving me completely free. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, instantly cutting off the suffocating tension of the ballroom, leaving me completely free. The lobby of the Waldorf Astoria was a stark, beautiful contrast to the absolute carnage I had just left behind. It was quiet, serene, and bathed in the warm golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music drifted from a nearby lounge, entirely undisturbed by the financial and emotional collapse happening just a few walls away. I walked across the intricate marble floors, my heels clicking with a steady rhythmic certainty. A few hotel staff members nodded politely as I passed, completely unaware that I had just orchestrated the total destruction of one of their most lavish events of the year. I did not rush. I took my time, enjoying the feeling of the cool, conditioned air against my skin, letting the residual adrenaline slowly fade from my system. As I approached the main entrance, the grand brass doors were pulled open by a white-gloved doorman. I stepped out from the stifling opulence of the hotel and into the crisp, cool New York City night. The evening air was sharp and refreshing, carrying the faint, familiar scent of rain and city pavement. The endless hum of Manhattan traffic sounded like a symphony of pure independence. I stood under the massive awning for only a brief moment, before a sleek, immaculate black Maybach glided smoothly to the curb, stopping precisely where I stood. My driver, a fiercely loyal and discreet man named Thomas, immediately stepped out. He did not ask any questions about why I was leaving the wedding so early. He simply gave a respectful nod, opened the heavy rear door, and stood back. I stepped into the spacious, soundproof interior of the vehicle, sinking into the plush leather seat. The door closed with a solid, comforting thud, instantly silencing the noise of the city outside. This car was my personal sanctuary, a quiet fortress that I had earned through years of relentless, agonizing hard work. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the darkened cabin, displaying a cascade of urgent notifications. I bypassed the personal messages and immediately opened my secure banking and corporate email applications. The automated systems at Apex Capital had executed David Mitchell's orders with flawless precision. I watched the digital confirmations roll in one after another. The hostile takeover of Caldwell Tech was no longer just a verbal threat delivered at a podium. It was fully, legally locked in. The digital ledgers showed the complete freezing of Richard Caldwell's remaining assets. The transfer of the company's debt portfolio into my firm's direct control was finalized. The automated emails from my legal department confirmed that the federal bankruptcy filings were queued up and scheduled to hit the judge's desk at exactly 8 o'clock the next morning. It was a masterpiece of corporate execution. Richard Caldwell was completely boxed in with absolutely no financial oxygen left to breathe. As I reviewed the final confirmation screen, a new notification dropped down from the top of my phone. It was a text message. I looked at the sender name, Leo. The message preview showed a frantic, desperate string of apologies begging me to turn the car around, begging me to answer the phone, begging me to save him from the nightmare he had created for himself. I stared at his name on the glowing screen. For 16 years, that name had dictated my entire existence. When I saw that name, it used to mean I needed to pick up an extra shift at the diner. It meant I needed to skip lunch so he could have a new winter coat. It meant I had to swallow my own pride, endure exhaustion, and put my own dreams on indefinite hold. I thought about the boy I had raised in that freezing, rusted-out trailer park. I thought about the sacrifices I had made to ensure he never felt the sharp sting of the poverty we were born into. But the man who had just texted me was not that boy. That man was a cowardly fraud who had eagerly allowed his arrogant new family to hand me a place card that called me a housemaid. I did not read the rest of his message. I did not type out a final angry response. I simply swiped left on his name. A red button appeared on the screen offering me the option to permanently delete the conversation and block the contact. I pressed it without a single ounce of hesitation. His name vanished from my screen. His number was blocked from my network. The digital severance was just as absolute and final as the emotional one. I turned my phone off and tossed it onto the empty leather seat beside me. I leaned my head back against the headrest and looked out the tinted window as the Maybach accelerated smoothly down Park Avenue. The chapter of my life where I played the role of the sacrificial lamb was officially over. I was finally truly alone, and I had never felt more powerful. 6 months passed since that night at the Waldorf Astoria, and the transition from my chaotic past into my highly controlled present was entirely seamless. I sat behind the massive custom-built mahogany desk in my penthouse office at Apex Capital. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the Manhattan skyline, a sprawling ocean of steel and glass that I now comfortably dominated. The air in my office was perfectly climate-controlled, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and fresh leather. There was no noise. There was no shouting. There was only the quiet, steady hum of absolute corporate power. The heavy frosted glass doors to my office slid open silently, and David Mitchell stepped inside. He looked just as sharp and unbothered as he had on the night he crashed the wedding, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a sleek silver tablet instead of a leather binder. He crossed the expansive room with his usual purposeful stride and took a seat in one of the leather chairs opposite my desk. "Good morning, Madam President," David said, his voice carrying its usual crisp, professional cadence. "I have the finalized quarterly reports ready for your review. This includes the complete end-to-end postmortem on the Caldwell Tech acquisition." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together and resting them on the polished mahogany surface. "Proceed," I instructed him, my tone completely clinical. David tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up a series of financial charts that automatically synced to the large monitor mounted on the wall to my right. The liquidation process concluded yesterday afternoon, he explained, his eyes scanning the digital numbers. We completely dismantled their corporate infrastructure. We sold off their remaining hardware patents to a competitor in Silicon Valley for a massive premium that exceeded our initial projections by 20%. The former Caldwell headquarters building was gutted, rebranded, and leased to a highly profitable medical research firm. Apex Capital walked away with a phenomenal net profit from the salvage operation. "And what about Richard Caldwell?" I asked, my voice betraying no emotion whatsoever. David allowed a rare, grim smile to touch the corners of his mouth. Richard is currently sitting in a federal holding facility without bail, David replied smoothly. The Department of Justice did not take his massive pension embezzlement lightly. His legal team attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but the sheer volume of stolen employee funds, combined with the irrefutable paper trail our forensic accountants handed over to the authorities, made any leniency completely impossible. His trial is scheduled to begin next month, and the federal prosecutors are aggressively pushing for a maximum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I nodded slowly, absorbing the reality of his downfall. The man who had stood on a brightly lit stage and arrogantly offered me a minimum wage job cleaning his toilets was now staring down the barrel of a decade and a half behind bars. The financial fallout for the rest of his family has been equally absolute. David continued swiping to the next screen on his tablet. The banks moved aggressively the moment the federal indictments were unsealed. They foreclosed on the Caldwell family's primary estate in the Hamptons and their luxury penthouse in the city. Every single one of their personal assets, right down to Brenda Caldwell's designer jewelry collection, was completely frozen and seized by the government to help pay back the defrauded employees. I looked out the window at the towering skyscrapers. Brenda Caldwell had looked me in the eye and demanded I leave the venue so my poverty would not rub off on her pristine family. Now she was experiencing the exact same terrifying, helpless financial ruin she had so viciously mocked me for enduring. Brenda attempted to maintain her social standing in the immediate aftermath, David noted, reading from his briefing notes with a hint of dry amusement. But the moment the embezzlement went public, the elite society she worshipped completely excommunicated her. Their exclusive country club memberships were revoked overnight. The charity boards she sat on publicly removed her name from their registries. Nobody in their former wealthy social circle will even return their phone calls. They went from being the toast of the town to total pariahs in less than 48 hours. They are currently renting a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, living entirely off whatever meager savings were not tied to the corporation. I listened to the report without a single ounce of guilt or regret. It was not revenge. It was simply the natural, undeniable consequence of their own unchecked arrogance. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of wealth and the subjugation of people they considered beneath them. They had believed their money made them untouchable gods, and gravity had simply caught up with them. "Excellent work, David," I said, signing off on the digital report with a quick swipe of my finger. "Distribute the acquisition profits according to our standard corporate restructuring protocols. Let us close the book on the Caldwell family entirely. They are no longer our concern." David nodded, closing out the files on his tablet. He stood up from the leather chair and adjusted his suit jacket, preparing to leave my office and return to his own executive suite. But as he reached the frosted glass doors, he paused and turned back to face me. "There is one more thing you might find interesting," Madam President, David added, his tone shifting slightly from strictly business to a more observant personal note. "It concerns your brother." I kept my expression carefully neutral, though I motioned for him to continue. David leaned against the heavy wooden doorframe. Simone Caldwell filed for an annulment exactly 48 hours after the wedding reception. She did not even wait for the ink to dry on the marriage certificate. The moment the federal agents raided her father's corporate offices, she had her family attorneys draft the dissolution paperwork. She cited fraud as the primary reason for ending the marriage, claiming Leo deliberately misrepresented his financial status and his corporate employment. He was physically removed from their rented luxury penthouse by private security before the weekend was even over. He was left standing on the curb with a single suitcase. He walked away with absolutely nothing. No settlement, no severance, and certainly no family. I nodded, slowly processing the information. It was exactly the ruthless transactional behavior I had expected from Simone. She had only loved the illusion of his wealth, and the second the money vanished, so did her loyalty. Thank you for the update, David, I replied softly. That will be all. David gave a final respectful nod and stepped out. The heavy frosted glass doors slid shut behind him, leaving me entirely alone in the expansive silence of my office. I pushed my leather executive chair back and stood up, walking slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that lined the southern wall of my penthouse. The morning sun was bright, reflecting brilliantly off the glass and steel canyons of the financial district. I looked down at the bustling city streets far below. From this incredible height, the yellow taxis and hurried pedestrians looked like tiny, insignificant gears turning in a massive, relentless machine. My eyes drifted across the wide, busy avenue, eventually settling on a small, independent coffee shop, nestled on the ground floor of the opposing building. They had a modest outdoor seating area on the sidewalk. As I watched, a worker emerged from the side door of the cafe, carrying a heavy plastic bucket and a cleaning rag. Even from several stories up, I recognized his posture immediately. I recognized the defeated slump of his shoulders and his exhausted, dragging walk. It was Leo. He was wearing a faded, deeply stained brown apron over a plain white t-shirt and cheap, worn-out sneakers. The tailored tuxedos, the expensive haircuts, and the heavy gold watches from 6 months ago were entirely gone, replaced by the harsh, unforgiving uniform of minimum wage labor. I watched silently as my brother dipped the rag into the bucket, wrung out the dirty water, and began aggressively scrubbing a sticky coffee spill off one of the metal patio tables. This was the exact same grueling, repetitive labor he had allowed the Caldwell family to mock me for. He had sat at a luxurious table and laughed when they called me a maid. He had practically begged me to sign a fake janitorial contract just to appease the wealthy people he was desperately trying to impress. Now the heavy, suffocating weight of absolute karma had crushed his grand illusions, forcing him into the very life he had so openly despised. He scrubbed the metal table until his arms must have ached. When he was finally finished, he tossed the dirty rag back into the plastic bucket. But instead of turning around and going back inside the coffee shop to escape the morning rush, Leo paused. He stood on the crowded sidewalk, wealthy corporate employees rushing past him without a second glance, and he slowly lifted his head. He looked straight across the busy avenue, his gaze traveling up the towering reflective glass facade of the Apex Capitol building. He tipped his head back further and further, his eyes tracing the sheer vertical height of the skyscraper until he was looking directly at the top floor. He was looking right at my penthouse. He knew I was up here. He knew that the sister he had so casually discarded was currently sitting at the absolute pinnacle of the financial world, commanding billions of dollars and deciding the fates of entire corporations. He knew that with one single phone call, I could have paid off his rent, bought him a house, or given him a life of total financial freedom. He knew exactly what he had thrown away for a fleeting, fraudulent taste of high society. Our eyes did not meet. The tinted, reinforced privacy glass of my office window made it impossible for him to see me standing there looking down at him. But the physical distance between us, just a few hundred feet of concrete and air, felt like an unbridgeable infinite void. We were existing in two completely different universes now. I watched him stand there for another long moment, a tiny, defeated figure dwarfed by the massive empire I had built. Finally, a manager barked an order at him from the doorway, breaking his miserable trance. Leo quickly lowered his head, grabbed his plastic bucket, and shuffled back inside the shop, disappearing entirely into the shadows of the kitchen. Leo quickly lowered his head, grabbed his plastic bucket, and shuffled back inside the shop, disappearing entirely into the shadows of the kitchen. I stood by the window for a few moments longer, watching the heavy glass door of the coffee shop swing shut. The space on the sidewalk where he had just stood was immediately swallowed up by the relentless, unbothered flow of Manhattan pedestrians. Nobody noticed him leave, and nobody noticed the ghost of a failed executive wiping down their tables. The absolute finality of the moment settled over me, not as a heavy burden, but as a profound, weightless relief. I did not feel the sudden urge to call him. I did not feel the familiar toxic pull of guilt that had dictated my actions for over a decade. I turned my back out the window physically and symbolically, leaving my brother exactly where he belonged. I walked across the plush carpet of my penthouse office and took my seat behind the massive mahogany desk. The surface was meticulously organized, a perfect reflection of the control I now held over my own destiny. Resting precisely in the center of the desk was a thick cream-colored folder. It was not a hostile takeover file. It was not an audit of a failing tech company or a list of liquidated assets. I opened the folder, smoothing my hand over the crisp pages of a brand new philanthropic initiative. My legal team had spent the last 3 months finalizing the details of a massive multi-million-dollar grant program. I had personally designed it to provide substantial seed funding mentorship and full university scholarships to young women coming from severely disadvantaged backgrounds. Specifically, the grant was aimed at women who had been forced to drop out of school to become primary caretakers for their families. It was designed for women who had scrubbed floors, worked graveyard shifts, and sacrificed their own futures to keep the lights on for someone else. I was taking the wealth I had built from absolutely nothing and using it to make sure those women never had to choose between their family's survival and their own incredible potential. I picked up my favorite silver fountain pen, feeling the comfortable, familiar weight of it in my hand. As I unscrewed the cap, I allowed myself to truly reflect on the concept of family. Society conditions us to believe that blood is an unbreakable contract. We are taught from a very young age that we must tolerate disrespect, endure endless manipulation, and forgive the unforgivable simply because we share the same biology. But the truth I had learned through years of exhaustion and ultimate betrayal was completely different. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty. DNA does not entitle anyone to a lifetime of your unconditional sacrifice. Family is not determined by a birth certificate. Family is a daily active choice to show up, to protect, and to value one another. Respect must be earned, and it must be maintained. I spent the entirety of my 20s building a boy. I poured my youth, my energy, and every single dollar I earned into a foundation I thought would support us both. But instead of standing on that foundation with gratitude, he used it to buy a cheap, glittering mask of vanity. He looked at my calloused hands and felt only shame. He chose the hollow applause of strangers over the unwavering love of the sister who raised him. He traded his integrity for a seat at a bankrupt table. I could not change the past, nor could I reclaim the years I spent working in that roadside diner. But the future was entirely mine to command. I was no longer the frightened girl trying to keep a roof over her brother's head. Now I am spending my 30s building an empire, and more importantly, I am filling that empire with people who actually understand the value of hard work, the weight of a promise, and the absolute necessity of mutual respect. I looked down at the signature line at the bottom of the grant document. I did not hesitate for a single second. I placed the nib of the silver pen against the heavy paper and signed my name with fluid, confident strokes. The woman who signed that paper was not Nora the housemaid. She was a self-made titan, an architect of her own incredible reality, and a woman who had finally learned how to protect her own peace at all costs. I set the pen down gently and leaned back in my executive chair. I looked around my quiet, sunlit office, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. A serene, genuine smile spread across my face. Have you ever had to walk away from a family member who only loved what you could provide for them? How did you find the strength to choose yourself? I would love to hear your stories of resilience and boundary setting in the comments below. Remember, your worth is never defined by the people who fail to appreciate you. Thank you for listening to my story. Please like and subscribe for more journeys of healing and absolute empowerment. The screen fades to black. The story of Nora and her brother Leo offers a profound and unflinching look at the toxic dynamics that can hide behind the concept of family. The most crucial lesson we can extract from this narrative is that biological ties do not obligate you to endure disrespect, nor do they guarantee unconditional loyalty. For over a decade, Nora sacrificed her youth, her education, and her financial stability to act as a shield for her younger brother. She even shrank her own success, hiding her wealth under a cheap cardigan, just to accommodate his fragile ego and appease his arrogant new in-laws. Yet when faced with the glittering illusion of high society, Leo discarded her without a second thought. His betrayal illustrates a harsh reality that many of us face. You cannot buy someone's character with your own sacrifices. Pouring all your energy into someone who views your past struggles as an embarrassment will only leave you emotionally exhausted and unappreciated. The moment Nora stopped playing the sacrificial lamb and stepped fully into her own power, the entire dynamic shifted. She taught us that true empowerment comes from recognizing when a relationship is purely transactional and having the absolute courage to walk away. Family should be a reciprocal sanctuary built on mutual respect, not a parasitic bond where one person is expected to suffer in silence to elevate the other. Nora's ultimate victory was not the corporate takeover, but the liberating realization of her own self-worth and her refusal to be hidden by the kitchen doors ever again. We must learn to set ironclad boundaries and stop setting ourselves on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. Take a moment today to evaluate the relationships in your life and boldly step away from anyone who demands you shrink your greatness to accommodate their insecurities.